You know, when you hear a phrase like spiritual growth or maybe personal enlightenment, there's almost always this really cinematic expectation that comes attached to it.
Absolutely. Like
Yeah.
you immediately picture someone meditating on a misty mountaintop, right?
Right, exactly. They're just sitting there perfectly still, breathing deeply, and then suddenly the clouds part.
Right. Cue the angelic music.
Exactly. A brilliant beam of sunlight hits them, and this profound, mystical lightning bolt of universal understanding just, you know, falls from the sky and instantly changes their life forever.
It's a very romanticized image. We have this collective cultural fantasy of the eureka moment.
Yeah.
The idea that transformation is something that happens to you rather than something you actively have to build. You just, I don't know, sit patiently and wait to be struck by wisdom.
But if you dive into the author of the text we're exploring today, the reality of that process is, well, far less cinematic.
Way less.
Right at the beginning of the text, the author makes this incredibly relatable observation. They point out that when we sit around passively waiting for sudden enlightenment to fall on us, usually the only thing that actually falls on us is sleepiness.
Which I love. It just grounds the entire conversation immediately, doesn't it?
It really does.
It completely shatters the illusion of effortless transformation. And it sets the stage for a much more pragmatic approach to human development.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We are unpacking a really fascinating source text today titled The 5 Pillars of Spiritual Growth and Daily Training.
It's a great read.
It is. And the core thesis we are examining today is that personal growth, whether you frame that as spiritual, emotional, or, psychological, it's not a sudden lightning strike. It's a deliberate, highly structured daily workout.
Yes.
Now, to be clear to you, the listener, the source text uses the language of faith. It talks about making covenants, serving within a church, and relying on a heavenly Father.
Right. It is definitely written from a specific religious perspective.
Yeah. But what makes this text so universally compelling is the behavioral psychology operating underneath all that theological language.
And that is the exact lens we are using today.
Exactly.
Without endorsing or, debating the specific religious theology, we're looking objectively at the psychological and behavioral tools the author provides. Because regardless of your personal worldview, this text presents a really sophisticated architectural approach.
An architecture for moving from abstract belief into concrete, sustainable action.
Right.
So if sudden enlightenment is mostly a myth that just makes us need a nap, how does this framework suggest we actually begin the process of growth?
Well, it starts with a concept that pushes against the way most modern, rational people prefer to operate.
Yeah, the author argues that action actually has to precede understanding.
The text refers to this initial phase as obedient exploration.
Obedient exploration.
Yeah, and we live in an era where we want all the data up front.
Right.
We tell ourselves that once someone explains the mechanics perfectly, and, once we comprehend every single variable, then we will take the action.
But this text suggests that approach is totally backwards.
Completely backwards.
The author actually illustrates this with a story about a woman who was experiencing lingering doubts about her faith community. Her logical brain wasn't fully on board, She didn't have all the answers. But instead of paralyzing herself with analysis, she chose to keep serving.
She stayed engaged.
Right. She continued honoring her covenants, which are basically deep, sacred promises made to her community and to herself. She let her hands and feet follow the framework, even when her head was lagging behind.
And by maintaining that forward motion, the text notes she eventually experienced a profound internal conviction, one that transcended pure logic.
She arrived at an undeniable, this is true moment, but she got there through action.
And to explain the mechanics behind this, the author uses a fantastic modern analogy. They compared divine instruction to getting a brand new smartphone.
Oh, I loved this part.
Right. When you unbox a complex piece of technology, you don't sit down at your kitchen table and read the 60-page technical manual from cover to cover before turning the device on.
No one does that.
You'd be bored to tears. And honestly, you still wouldn't really know how to use it.
Yeah.
So the instruction here is essentially, don't read the manual first. Just touch the screen, swipe around, open an app, and just see how the interface responds.
Because the understanding doesn't come from memorizing the manual. The understanding is a direct result of the tactile experience.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this, because if we look at this through a purely secular physiological lens, it is exactly the same mechanism as building muscle memory.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Think about learning to ride a bicycle.
Yeah.
You cannot sit in a library reading a physics textbook to learn how to ride a bike.
No, you'd fall right over.
Right. You can memorize every equation regarding momentum, gravity, gyroscopic balance, but the second you get on that seat, you are going to fall over. You just have to pedal.
You have to feel it.
The physical action creates a feedback loop that teaches the brain how to balance. But I do want to push back on the source text here for a second.
Go ahead.
Because if you're hearing this, the idea of just do it and you'll understand later probably sounds a bit risky. It really flirts with the concept of blind faith.
It does sound like that at first glance.
So how does this text differentiate between a productive, healthy, experiential learning process and just blindly following orders without critical thought?
What's fascinating here is that the text is incredibly careful with its phrasing. It deliberately calls it obedient exploration.
Exploration.
Right. The framework is not advocating for intellectual surrender. It isn't asking anyone to turn off their brain or act as a passive automaton.
Okay.
Instead, it's acknowledging a really hard psychological boundary. Some forms of knowledge are entirely locked behind the door of experience.
Like the bike riding.
Exactly like the bike riding. You literally cannot access the data you need to make an informed decision until you perform the action.
So it's closer to running a scientific experiment on your own life.
Precisely. When the woman in the story kept serving her community despite her doubts, she was actively gathering data. She was putting the principles to a rigorous stress test in her daily routine.
Okay, I see.
It is the fundamental difference between obeying a dictator out of fear and trusting a sports coach enough to run the grueling drill they prescribed. You know, the physical exhaustion of the drill is what will eventually reveal the lesson.
That makes the distinction much clearer. You have to get on the field to feel the rhythm of the game.
You do.
So if we accept that we learn by doing, how does that translate into the way we treat the people around us? Because this brings us to a radical shift away from the self.
A huge shift.
The text leans on a warning from a historical figure named President Lorenzo Sano, and he cautions heavily against getting buried in fleeting, self-centric anxieties.
And that sounds like fairly standard philosophical advice, until the author anchors it with a truly striking anecdote.
Yeah, the hurricane story.
Right. The text describes a couple whose home is completely destroyed by a massive hurricane. Their lives are just totally upended.
Yeah, everything is gone.
Now, basic human survival instinct dictates that in a disaster, your vision narrows entirely to your own crisis. You fix your own roof, you secure your own resources, and you panic over your own losses.
That's just biology.
Exactly. But this couple made a counterintuitive choice. They walked away from their own wreckage.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. They walked away and spent their immediate time helping their neighbors dig out of the debris. And the text notes that through this process of outward focus, a path eventually opened up that solved their own housing crisis.
The author frames this outward focus using another great technological metaphor. They claim that spiritual Wi-Fi is free and unlimited.
Free and unlimited.
Yeah, the text urges people to connect to that broader divine network, rather than exhausting themselves by trying to solve every problem using their own limited individual data plan.
It's a brilliant way to describe the human tendency to over-rely on our own sheer willpower, which is, a highly finite resource.
So what does this all mean? When we look at the story of the hurricane, I really want to dig into the mechanics of that outcome.
Let's do it.
Is the text suggesting a literal transactional magic trick? Like, if you help your neighbor clear some branches, the universe will magically drop a new house into your lap.
Right, like karma as an ATM.
Exactly. Or is this pointing towards something much deeper about how serving others breaks us out of our own psychological paralysis?
This raises an important question, and the psychological mechanics here are deeply compelling. When you are standing in front of your own ruined house, the sheer scale of the disaster maxes out your cognitive bandwidth.
Yeah, you just overload.
You're flooded with cortisol, paralyzed by grief, and trapped in an anxiety loop. Your brain literally cannot process a solution because it is suffocating under the weight of the immediate trauma.
You are too close to the wreckage to see anything else.
Exactly. But the moment you walk over to your neighbor's yard to help them, you regain your agency. You transition from being a passive victim of a hurricane to an active problem solver.
Wow.
You break the internal paralysis of the self. By shifting your focus outward, your emotional landscape regulates. And often, that psychological unblocking is exactly what allows your brain to finally see the path forward for your own life.
So the reward isn't necessarily a magical transaction. It's a profound restoration of your own perspective.
That's beautifully put, yes.
And the text gives another slightly more everyday example of how toxic our own perspective can become if we stay entirely focused on ourselves and our grievances.
Oh, the phone memo story.
Yes. There's a story about a woman who was keeping a running list of her husband's faults on her smartphone's memo app. Every time he made a mistake, she logged it.
Which highlights a very modern, very exhausting habit. We use technology to literally keep receipts on the people we love.
Yeah.
We curate databases of resentment.
The text points out that she only found peace when she finally deleted that list. She actively chose to focus her mind on the heavy, unseen burdens her husband was carrying instead.
It's a total pivot.
Right. And to contrast that toxic habit, the author shares a story about an illiterate missionary. A leader asked the Lord to assess this young man, fully expecting a harsh critique of his inability to read or, perform basic tasks. But the assessment that came back didn't judge the missionary's current limitations at all. It simply noted his trajectory, stating he is wiser than before.
That is the core of what the text calls looking through the Lord's eyes. The framework challenges you to view a person's entire trajectory rather than taking a hypercritical snapshot of their current location.
Right.
When you evaluate someone based solely on their immediate flaws, like maintaining a memo app of their worst moments, you force yourself to carry the immense psychological weight of all that resentment.
It's heavy.
It takes a massive amount of emotional energy to be perpetually annoyed.
It is exhausting to constantly play the role of the judge.
But when you adopt that broader perspective, acknowledging their hidden burdens and recognizing that they are inching forward, you swap criticism for compassion.
Yeah.
And compassion is a significantly lighter psychological load to carry. You essentially free yourself from the exhaustion of judgment.
That is a beautiful concept. But it brings us to a major friction point in the text.
Okay.
Prioritizing others, deleting our grievances, and accessing this unlimited spiritual Wi-Fi does not somehow immunize us against tragedy.
No, it doesn't.
Hurricanes still obliterate houses. People still experience profound suffering. So how does this framework instruct a person to handle inevitable, painful adversity?
Well, it requires redefining the nature of struggle itself.
How?
The author tackles a modern vulnerability here that we might call the microwave fallacy.
The microwave fallacy.
Right. Because of technology, we are conditioned to expect instantaneous results. We want to place a complex life problem or a desperate prayer into a spiritual microwave, press a button, and receive a fully resolved, piping hot answer 30 seconds later.
But the text is blunt. Divine answers and personal growth are not microwavable. Often the response to a plea for help isn't a neat solution, but an instruction to research first. Or think about it.
It demands collaboration.
Exactly. And to explain why this delay is necessary, the author uses the metaphor of a chick breaking out of its eggshell or a butterfly tearing its way out of a cocoon.
It is a very visceral biological image. If you intervene and cut the cocoon open to save the butterfly from the agonizing struggle of emerging, the butterfly will die. Yeah, it will have swollen fluid in its body and shriveled wings. The agonizing physical struggle of pushing against the resistance of the cocoon is the exact biological mechanism required to pump fluid into the wings and build the strength necessary to survive in the outside world.
The author uses a fantastic phrase here, spiritual protein. The trials and the friction generate the internal protein necessary to build muscle.
Spiritual protein, I love that.
Yeah. Our job is not to passively wait for the universe to save us, but to actively search and struggle through the problem. But here's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
I understand the spiritual protein concept on an intellectual level, but if someone listening is in the absolute deepest, darkest part of a genuine crisis, like if they are facing an illness or a devastating loss, calling their pain protein might feel incredibly cold.
It could, yeah.
Does framing it this way risk crossing into toxic positivity or glamorizing human suffering?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text actually provides a very sturdy guardrail against toxic positivity. It explicitly validates the reality of human emotion. Oh, good. Yeah, it states clearly that it is entirely normal to hate going through trials. The framework does not ask you to slap a fake smile on your face and pretend that suffering is enjoyable. You don't have to pretend you're having fun during the hurricane.
That is a massive relief. It allows space for actual grief.
Exactly. What it does do is radically reframe the role of the divine. It doesn't present God as an absentee landlord who capriciously allows bad things to happen. It frames the divine as a master coach.
A coach.
A coach puts you through grueling resistance training, not to humiliate you, but to expose your weak points so you can fortify them. It is about the psychology of post-traumatic growth.
Okay.
By redefining adversity as resistance training, you transition from being a helpless victim of circumstance to an active participant in your own rescue. You aren't just needlessly enduring pain, you're actively synthesizing the protein required to survive the next storm.
You are building the muscle memory we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
So, understanding the philosophy of spiritual protein and outward focus is wonderful in theory. But high-level theory doesn't change what you do on a random Tuesday morning.
No, it doesn't.
How does the author suggest we actually practice this? This is where the text pivots from grand architecture to a highly practical 5-step daily regimen. And the way these steps are structured is fascinating.
This is the daily training aspect of the title. The author moves away from sweeping theology and gets incredibly granular with human behavior.
Let's look at the first concept, spiritual decluttering. The author suggests utilizing the weekly sacrament, which is essentially a dedicated communal time for reflection, to identify and discard just one un-Christ-like or negative trait that week, not 10 things, just one single habit or reaction.
Which is incredibly smart from a behavioral standpoint. When people try to overhaul their entire personality overnight, they almost always fail because the cognitive load is too high.
Right.
This is highly targeted incremental pruning.
The second concept is daily prioritization. Before you allow yourself to stare at your own massive, overwhelming pile of personal problems for the day, you must stop and ask, who can I help today? And then you execute one small act of service.
This is a daily micro-application of the hurricane story. It is a deliberate habit designed to break the paralysis of the self before the anxiety of the day can even take root.
The third tool is perhaps the most practical, the mental delete button.
I love this one.
It's so good. When you feel a critical or resentful emotion bubbling up about a colleague or a family member, the text suggests you literally visualize a smartphone prompt in your mind's eye that asks delete, and you mentally click yes.
In secular psychology, that is known as pattern interruption. You are forcing your brain to recognize a negative neurological loop and actively shutting it down before it can cascade into a full-blown mood.
The fourth tool is the 30-minute rule. If you are praying or meditating on a problem and the answer doesn't come immediately combating that spiritual microwave we talked about, you commit to putting in 30 minutes of actual focused physical effort or research to solve the problem yourself, and only then do you ask for guidance again.
It demands that you put some skin in the game. It proves you are willing to engage in the struggle of the cocoon rather than just waiting for someone to cut you out of it.
And the final piece of the regimen is recording the didn't run away moment. At the end of every day, you journal or write down one tiny specific moment where you faced a point of friction instead of avoiding it. You document a moment where you acted like the chick breaking the eggshell.
That acts as a form of exposure therapy and positive reinforcement. By writing it down, you are actively rewriting your own self-narrative to view yourself as a resilient person.
When you look at all these concepts grouped together, the pattern interruption of the delete button, the incremental exposure, the gratitude-style journaling, to you, the listener, doesn't this sound exactly like modern cognitive behavioral therapy?
It really does.
It's highly practical, evidence-based habit tracking wrapped beautifully in a spiritual context.
It absolutely is, and that is why the text's conclusion, referring to God as a great coach, is so fitting.
Right.
A truly great coach doesn't just stand at the front of a locker room delivering abstract speeches about the philosophy of winning. A great coach hands you a highly specific daily drill sheet.
Like the 5 steps.
Yes, they tell you exactly how to place your feet, how to breathe, and what repetitive motions to execute. The underlying argument of this text is that these quiet, repetitive microactions, hitting a mental delete button on a resentment, helping one neighbor, studying a problem for 30 minutes, are the only mechanisms that actually guarantee sustainable human change.
It is the daily, unglamorous workout. True growth isn't a loud, sudden lightning bolt. It is the quiet, almost invisible accumulation of hundreds of small, deliberate choices.
It turns the chaos of everyday life into a structured training ground. But before we finish our analysis today, there is one final concept that naturally extrapolates from the author's framework, and it's something worth pondering deeply.
Let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time discussing the power of spiritual decluttering on a strictly individual level. You know, the practice of a single person deliberately discarding just one negative trait or utilizing the mental delete button for their personal grievances.
Right.
But imagine what would happen if we scaled those incredibly practical tools up to a societal level.
Oh, wow. That is a massive shift in scale.
What if an entire community, a corporate workplace, or even just a large extended family collectively agreed to hit delete on one specific cultural grievance every single week?
That would be amazing.
What if, instead of maintaining a collective societal memo app where we constantly catalog the worst mistakes of opposing groups, an entire community committed to prioritizing their neighbors' burdens over their own arguments for just 7 days?
Just 7 days.
Could the culture of a city or a nation be healed and strengthened just as quietly and methodically as the individual mind? I invite everyone listening to evaluate their own circles. If your community was going to initiate a collective spiritual decluttering, what should the very first deleted item be?
That is a brilliant and challenging question to leave hanging in the air, because if we have learned anything today, it is that waiting around for a sudden lightning bolt of universal enlightenment to fix our problems will probably just put us to sleep. The manual is in front of us. It is time to wake up, touch the screen, hit delete on the things holding us back, and get to work.